Good morning. Good morning, church. I'm Pastor Jackie Ranieri, and on behalf of Pastor Bob Miller and Pastor Susie Todd, I welcome you here this morning to worship. I welcome you here in this room with me, and I also want to say a special shout out to those that are watching online. Good morning. And Dale, I'm sorry, I'm on this side of the screen this week, so welcome. I'm glad you're here from Alabama. I had to give you a shout out there this morning, but welcome. It's week 3. Week 3 of our series, Bless. And this has been a series where we learn how to connect and bless the people around us. Pastor Bob started our series off with asking us to pray for our neighbors. And I have to tell you, I kind of struggled with that. You see, I'm new to my neighborhood, and I don't know any of my neighbors. I don't know anyone. So that's a challenge I'm taking to maybe meet a new neighbor once a week as I'm out trying to walk and see who I can find out that I can meet. And then last week, Pastor Susie talked about taking the time to listen to others. Wow. We can learn so much from people when we take the time to stop and hear their stories. You hear their history. You hear their passion. You hear their prayers, their struggles. We learn so much from each other when we take the time to stop and listen. So as Pastor Bob and Pastor Susie have shared these last few weeks, people who call themselves Christ followers, like us here, people who call themselves Christ followers are tasked with one great commission by Jesus, and that is, therefore go. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Spirit and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. Yes, many hear that passage and feel very inadequate to go out and share Jesus' love with others, much less your neighbors. You see, this series we are sharing is designed to equip you. And as I said a moment ago, we're in the 3rd week. So that gives us the letter E. And I get the fun task about talking about eating. Everybody likes to eat, right? So what does eating have to do with our neighbors? And I have to say, though, when you think about that, would you agree that our neighborhoods have changed? I remember growing up in a subdivision where everyone knew our name, especially us kids. And as a kid, I didn't get away with anything because when I got caught doing something wrong, my parents knew about it before I even got home. That's what the party line was a great thing for. Everybody knew everybody. But it seems like today that folks like to hang out in their backyards. Sound familiar? I know I'm very guilty about that. We've taken our patio and created a little oasis out in our backyard. We've got furniture, we've got the TV out there, we've got a pavilion out there, and we spend many hours out in our backyard. Yesterday we watched football games out in our backyard. And I love just sitting out at night in my backyard. So when I talk about eating, how are we supposed to get to know our neighbors when most of us are spending time in the backyard? Well, today I want to help you with that. And I want to talk about eating and how you can make and be disciples with eating. Sound interesting? Are you intrigued? You see, the truth is we all have a love affair with food. Think about that. Especially when the experience is with someone we share the meal with. Something special happens when we gather around the table. And did you know that much of Jesus' ministry involved conversations around the table? In Luke's gospel alone, there are 10 stories of Jesus dining and talking with various people. Active listening coupled with a good meal can catapult a casual acquaintance into a growing friendship. And it's not surprising, though, to hear that the strongest examples of eating together come from Jesus. And when you read the Bible, have you ever noticed that part of how Jesus blessed and saved the world was by eating? And I know it probably sounds crazy, right? But eating was central to Jesus' mission of loving others and showing them God's love. For instance, The first miracle we hear about is at a wedding feast, right? And then one of Jesus' most well-known miracles was feeding of the 5,000 on a hill in a countryside. Then there was that night before Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus brought together his closest friends for a meal. And after Jesus' resurrection, Jesus shared breakfast on the beach with his disciples. And I think many of us don't get how big a deal eating was in Jesus' culture. It was a statement of friendship. It was an affirmation of that person's value, their dignity and worth. And who you ate with indicated who you loved and considered to be part of your social class. And one of the best examples we have in the Bible comes from Matthew, when Jesus eats with a tax collector. And what makes this story so interesting is it's Matthew who's the tax collector. This is what Matthew writes. Matthew says, "As Jesus continued on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a kiosk for collecting taxes. He said to him, 'Follow me.' And he got up and he followed him. And as Jesus sat down to eat in Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners joined Jesus and his disciples at the table. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?' And when Jesus heard it, he said, 'Healthy people don't need a doctor, but sick people do. Go and learn what this means. I want mercy and not sacrifice. I don't come to call righteous people, but sinners.'" You see, in Jesus' day, tax collectors were considered lowlifes. They worked for the Roman Empire, and tax collectors were rarely seen or even spoken to, and they were not somebody you would really want to spend a meal with. But did you notice something? Did you notice what Jesus did after he invited Matthew to follow him? Jesus went to Matthew's house and sat at the table. And who else joins in on this meal? Why, more tax collectors, of course, along with a whole group of people that were considered as sinners. Now, this term sinner in Jesus' day was used for anybody who wasn't religious or who was involved in maybe an illicit lifestyle like prostitution. But this crowd at Matthew's house was a true who's who of social unaccepted. Jesus was on a mission with his life. And the Pharisees, well, they didn't get it. And for them, the priority was obedience to laws, which they were all good at. But for Jesus, he was there to bless the people. Jesus came to show them grace, to show them mercy. And not just to hope people would find their way back to God, but to show them the way. So Jesus' method to his mission was eating with those who were seeking, with those who were lost. And he blessed and he loved people by sharing meals with them. It was around the table in the upper room that Jesus used the bread to tell his disciples his body would be beaten. It would be stabbed, it would be bruised, and then it would be hung on a tree. And then he grabbed the wine and he used it to represent the blood that would pour out of him. It was around a table that Jesus spoke words that had become foundational to us, his followers. Author and Bible scholar N.T. Wright writes this. He says, "When Jesus himself wanted to explain to his disciples what his forthcoming death was all about, he didn't give them theory. He gave them a meal." But does it work? Think about it. Does something as simple as sharing a meal, eating with someone, change lives? I happened to see it happen at my parents' house. We were living in Gladwin, and my parents bought property right next door to us, and so we had a little compound there. And after my sister was divorced, she moved herself and her 2 kids up into my parents' house from Florida. My mom was a consultant and was out of state quite a bit. My sister traveled with her job. My husband worked evenings and weekends, and our son worked at the restaurant where my husband was working a few evenings during the week. So that left my dad, my niece, my nephew, and myself alone for dinner. So I would go over to my parents' house and help my dad out with making the meal and make sure everything was set up and that. And for a while, it was just the 4 or 5 of us if my son was home or whoever else in the family was home. Well, then the kids started inviting friends over for dinner. And it got to the point where there would be anywhere from 8 to 18 people sitting around my parents' dining room table. And there were nights when my son was working, but a couple of his friends would show up for dinner anyways. There was kids asking if they could just come because they wanted to join the table. And some would just show up at 5 o'clock because that's when dinner was every single night. No buts. 5 o'clock. It was crazy. And my dad would freak out every single night. How many of you are going to show up? Do you know? Have the kids said? Does anybody know? So he always tried to create something that would spread out a little bit more. And you know what? We always seemed to have enough. There was enough food there. And we didn't realize it, my dad and I, at the time, and we talked about it afterwards, and that we created a little small community around the dining room table. And in turn, these kids had a safe space. And us, we were blessed. We were blessed with these kids that came, that wanted to come to join our table. And one of the kids, these kids started sharing about their lives and their stories. And one young man shared that everyone in their house just made their own dinner at different times whenever they came in. Another shared that their mom made dinner, but everyone just made a plate and went to wherever they wanted to go sit. They didn't sit around a table. They didn't talk. And these kids, we found out, were not only hungry for food, but for someone to listen to them, for someone to encourage them and to make them feel like they mattered, they were important. And it became interesting when the kids showed up, because they would begin to help us set the table, bring chairs around the table. They'd put their phones in the basket because the rule was no phones at the table. And they all did it, and that was amazing. And then in the beginning, it was my family that would offer the blessing for the food. And little by little, these kids became comfortable. And it wasn't always pretty, but they offered blessing for the food. They got comfortable enough to sit around the table and offer a blessing that they weren't even doing on their own. It was beginning to see this. We had kids that were athletes. We had kids that were band or they were in choir, and the computer nerds because they loved calling themselves that. And we had popular kids, we had unpopular kids, we had kids that weren't really socially acceptable that my niece thought was very important to bring to this gathering. And the beautiful part of this was watching friendships grow. They started to build and they started to help each other with homework questions, how to handle a crush. They even supported each other when someone had a breakup with a boy or girl that they were hoping to be with. These kids started growing a tight-knit group. Recently, one of the girls shared with me how much it meant to be around the table, how much she got out of that time that we were with her and we sat with them, everyone there. We made everyone feel like they were part of the family. She shared that now that she has kids, her goal is that hopefully when her kids start to bring friends home, that they too experience that time around the table that she had. Yes, sharing a meal can be powerful. Author Henry Nouwen wrote about the power of eating together. This is what he wrote. He says, when we invite friends for a meal, we do so much more than just offer them food for their bodies. We offer friendship, fellowship, good conversation, intimacy, closeness. And when we say, help yourself, take some more, don't be shy, have another glass, we're offering our guests not only food and drink, but also ourselves. A spiritual bond that grows and we become food and drink for one another. This all sounds great, right? And when you think about praying about blessing your neighbors through this third practice of eating, it becomes very easy. But yet, that little voice, temptation comes up, and all of a sudden you have excuses, right? Excuses why this can't work. We say things like, I don't like to have people in my home. And a lot of times when thinking about having small groups made at your house, the first excuse is that I'm not much of a cook, or I don't like the way my house looks, and my table's really small. I can't see people gathering. But you know what? That's okay. If you don't like to have people over at your house, why not gather people at a restaurant? Or how about getting takeout and inviting people to your backyard? Order in. Don't think you have to prepare an 8-course meal. People aren't expecting that. The thing to remember is not about what you're eating or even where you're eating it. It's about who you are eating it with. Then there's excuse number 2. I don't know what to say. What am I going to say to these people? You see, a lot of us are not extroverts or even have entertaining personalities. And I know some of us get anxious, especially when we don't know what to talk about with folks we don't know very well. So let me share some advice here. Eating together provides great opportunity to listen. So instead of worrying about having the perfect words to say, focus on just being present. You'll be surprised how the conversation will start up, how people will share with one another. And then there's excuse number 3. I just don't have time. You ever feel that way? Sometimes our schedules get so busy. And I know many of us barely have enough time to eat with our own families, and here I am asking you to have meals with someone else. But how you think about this, let me give you another idea on how to think about it differently. See, eating is something we do on a daily basis, right? And if you think about it, everyone eats at least 2 to 3 meals a day, correct? And if you eat 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, there's 21 meals. Out of that 21, there's got to be a time when you can share that time with someone else. Now, I'm not asking you to do anything that I wouldn't do. Now, you see, one of the goals that I have here at Plymouth First working in the digital campus is to be out meeting 75 to 100 people a week. And I know I talk a lot about standing in lines because that's what I do a lot. But I also invite people out for a meal. I also invite people out to meet for coffee, just to have that time to have a conversation. Hear what they're saying, listening to them. And there's so much power when you take time to share a meal with someone. And once you start to practice the simple blessing of your neighbors, you might even discover that hospitality could be your spiritual gift that you didn't even know that you had. And I think you'll be amazed by how you can impact the lives of others, especially around the table. You're going to find yourself helping others eat their way into the kingdom of God. And you know what? You're not alone here. We have a great opportunity, and it was shared earlier, and this is my last plug-in for this next Saturday. What a great way to learn and be equipped on how to invite folks to eat with you in a small group. Even create a fresh expression. Amazing. Imagine that. Yes, on Saturday, September 17th, as you heard, from 9 to noon, and then with lunch to follow, we have Rachel Gilmore, who is the expert of Fresh Expressions and Digital Campus, and she's going to be here to share and to equip us on how we can invite people out for meals, how we can create small groups within our community. So what would it look like if you just hang out, eat, and have a conversation? Could you do that? You know, that could be someone's first taste of your church. Also, someone's first taste of God. Alan Hirsch and Lance Ford wrote in their book, Right Here, Right Now, that sharing a meal together is one of the most sacred practices we can engage in as believers. And then they even go as far to say that if every Christian family regularly invited a stranger or a poor person into their home for a meal once a week, we would literally change the world by eating. Doesn't that sound like fun? We change the world by eating. And I know there's many reasons that make eating together difficult and even uncomfortable for some, but I believe it's worth pushing. I truly believe, and I'm passionate that it's so important that we push through our excuses and we get out of our comfort zone so we can truly love our neighbors and change the world one meal at a time. Now, I'm one that I will suggest things, but I also practice what I preach. I really do. I practice this. And I love this idea of meeting with people, of sharing a meal, having a cup of coffee. So Kathy Montgomery and I started talking. And so we're going to start on the 1st and on the 3rd of each month, and we're going to start September 21st to meet at the Coffee Beanery right here in Plymouth. And we're going to invite all of you. Imagine the room that we would need at the table if everyone came. How cool would that be? But we want to gather together. I want to hear your stories. I want to get to know you better. I want to know how to pray for you. I want to know what you're passionate about. So what a great opportunity for us to meet over coffee and have that time. We're going to be meeting from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. and it's the 21st. More will be talked about that as the time comes up, but I invite you, please come. Come take that time. So for myself, I love to get to know you better. I love to get to talk to those that I talk to online on a weekly basis during our live stream time. So please consider joining us for a cup of coffee. So I shared what I'm going to do. So guess what? It's your turn. How are you going to go out this week and invite someone to share a meal? Are you willing? I hope so. Amen.